Greetings! I'm re-recording my fourth chess video in which I show the second game on the theme of fighting back. I'm going to present it much as I would present it to my students, preserving some of the detail as well as the showing of grandmaster games to which analysis of the game has led me for future videos. The game I'm about to show is associated with my fondest chess club memory. One summer, my nephew attended chess club with me. His games were done faster than mine were, and he'd call his father and get a ride home, so that he was usually long gone by the time my games finished. The night of this particular game, I was paired against the club's master, against whom I had lost a great many games, drawn a few, and won only a couple over the course of 2 decades. I was in for a long fight, and after giving up an exchange for a pawn, all I could do was fight for a draw. As it turned out, I actually won in a surprising turn of events. After the game finished, I sat back and looked up, and I saw a semicircle of observers who had been watching the game. This often happened when the club master's games ran late. Other people finished their games and wanted to see whether he would win according to form, or whether instead there would be an upset. And right in the middle of that semicircle of observers was my nephew. He had not gone home early, but had in fact stayed to watch, and he had seen me pick up one of my rare wins over the seemingly Olympian club master. That's my favorite chess club memory. My nephew's seeing me beat the master. As usual, when I record a chess video, I'm using chess.com's analysis board with the chess engine's Stockfish 12. This game began as a normal Roy Lopez or Spanish game. Black played Morphy's move, putting the question to the bishop. I retreated. Now, it's perfectly okay to play bishop takes knight. That's the exchange variation. But you shouldn't think that, oh, gee, you're winning a pawn. No, the black queen comes out, attacks both knight and pawn. You can't save both, so you're going to lose the pawn right back. So no, you're not winning a pawn that way. But the exchange variation is perfectly playable, and it might continue like this. Or it might continue a little differently with Fisher's variation, castling, and f6, and d4, and pawn takes, and knight takes. But either way, or some different way, there are two things to notice here. There are two things to notice. First, each side has a 4-on-3 pawn majority on one side of the board. Black has a 4-on-3 pawn majority on the queen side. White has a 4-on-3 pawn majority on the king side. But black's is a crippled pawn majority. All of those black pawns line up with white pawns. This guy in back isn't helping. If you took all of the pieces off of the board and left only the pawns, black could not force the creation of a passed pawn with his 4-on-3 pawn majority because it's a crippled pawn majority. On the other hand, white's pawn majority is a healthy pawn majority. Those pawns all line up, but this pawn doesn't line up with a black pawn. It is potentially a passed pawn. It's not a passed pawn yet, but it's potentially a passed pawn. And white, if you took all the pieces off the board, could force the creation of a passed pawn. Well, that will be an endgame advantage for white. That's the first thing to notice. White has that structural endgame advantage because of the pawn structure. Second thing to notice is black still has both of his bishops. Each side has 3 minor pieces. Black has 2 bishops and a knight. White has 2 knights and a bishop. But black has the advantage of the 2 bishops. And the board is at least semi-open. So that's an advantage for black. And it's generally thought that that compensates black for the disadvantage in pawn structure that he has. But yes, you can play the exchange variation. It's perfectly fine. I sometimes show my students the game Lasker Tarrasch from 1908. And Fischer won several games in the 1960s using it. It's perfectly fine to play. It's perfectly playable. But in this game, I did not play it. I retreated my bishop. And black brought his knight out, and I castled. And the reason white allows black to take the pawn is that he doesn't really mind. He knows he's going to get it back. Now, it's okay for black to take the pawn here. That is playable. But he shouldn't play it thinking, ha, I'm winning a pawn. No, white will get it back. White will get the pawn back. And black usually doesn't take. Now black is blocking the e file, along which white can sometimes get an attack. And he's preparing to castle. And white protects his e-pawn. And now white's threatening to win a pawn. If black went ahead and castled here, then white could take and then take the pawn. And if black tried to win back the pawn, as before, the knight would come back, which would attack the queen. So the queen would have to go somewhere. But the queen couldn't take the pawn because it's defended by the rook. So the queen would have to move somewhere. And after the queen did, then white could play d3, or he could play knight c3. Anyway, he could defend this pawn again. And black would not win the pawn. So white would have won a pawn. So because white now actually is threatening to win the e-pawn, black plays b5, preventing the bishop from taking that knight, which is the only thing holding up the e-pawn. And the bishop retreats. And now black castles. Main line is, or at least used to be, d6. This castling move is flexible. Black could play d6 on his next move. Yeah. But he could play d5. He could play the martial attack. Now, a lot of players don't like to face the martial attack. A lot of players, if white plays c3, a lot of players don't like facing this for various reasons, which I'll go into in another video. But because they dislike it, they find another move here instead of c3. They might play a4, they might play d3, they might play h3, they might even play d4. I'll go into that in another video. But I did not mind facing the martial attack, and I played c3. And indeed, the martial attack was played. My master friend never played it before that against me, and I don't think he's played it since. Just this one time. And I went ahead, took the pawn. And normally it will proceed knight takes pawn, knight takes, rook takes. So black has sacrificed the pawn. Now this knight's under attack twice and defended only once. So black will hold the knight up with a pawn. And then white might play d4, sometimes it's d3. And then this bishop attacks, and the rook comes back, and then the queen out, and now there's an attack on h2 by the queen and the bishop. So you see g3, and the queen goes to h3. And black is going to get a tremendous kingside attack with his bishops. He's going to bring this rook over to the e-file. He's going to push this pawn forward, and he's going to get a tremendous attack. This bishop usually comes here. And he can get a tremendous attack, and if white knows what he's doing, okay, he can survive. But the reason a lot of people like to avoid the martial attack is that even if white keeps his extra pawn, survives the attack, keeps his extra pawn into the endgame, black still has good drawing chances. So a lot of people don't like to face the martial attack. Anyway, that's not how it went in this game. It's not how this game went. Indeed, I took the pawn, but then my master friend played e4. I had never seen this before. I did not know what to do against it. Turns out I should have just played pawn takes knight. It's the natural move, and it's the best move. But I didn't know that, and the club master likes to do a particular thing that's frankly annoying if you don't really know your openings. He likes to find opening variations in which the natural move for his opponent is wrong. And I was afraid he was doing that this time. I was afraid that although that was the natural move, it was the wrong move, that he had selected one of these variations where the natural looking move is the wrong move. So I looked for something else, and I wound up playing my knight out to g5, which isn't horrible. And now you can just see this knight headed for d3. You just see that coming. And here I selected d4, which is a mistake, but I had a continuation in mind, which was not the best continuation as it turns out, but I didn't know that at the time. I sacrificed my rook. Well, I didn't sacrifice a whole rook, I sacrificed an exchange. So we traded pieces. Black took my rook, I took black's knight. So now I was down in exchange for 2 pawns. An exchange for 2 pawns can be dead even. It can even be better for the side with the 2 pawns. It depends on the particular position, as so many things do in chess. However, my 2 extra pawns are those 2 pawns. You can see those 3 line up with those 3, okay? And those 3 line up with those 3. So the 2 extra pawns I have are those 2. Now, if one of them, say this one, were over here, or if they were side by side, if it were there, if they were side by side, or just in adjacent files, I'd be happy. I'd be happy. I think the 2 pawns would be sufficient compensation for the exchange. But they're one right in front of the other. They're doubled up. And those aren't the world's greatest extra pawns to have. So at this point, I felt I was fighting for a draw. And again, against my master friend, I'm always fighting for a draw. At least I was then. Now black moves his king over, and there's a reason he did that. There's a reason black did that. He wanted to play f5, but there's a problem with that. If he does, I play d6, discovered check. And once he gets his king out of the way, I take his bishop, and he doesn't have time to take the knight because he'll lose his queen. He has to take the pawn, but then I get to save my knight somewhere, maybe on c5, maybe on g3, maybe on g5. I think I'd have gone to c5, but I get the chance to save my knight, and then what's the material look like? Queen for queen, queen for queen, rook for rook, bishop for bishop. But I'd have a pair of knights for his rook. Not only would I have a pair of knights, I'd have this extra pawn. So I'd have 2 pieces and a pawn for the rook, which would be better for white. Now, that doesn't mean white's going to crush black in the game, but it's better for white. Now, if you look at Stockfish's evaluation, yes, it looks like white is crushing black. But anyway, that would have been good for white. So first, before pushing the f pawn and opening up this diagonal, he moved his king over so that he could play f5 without exposing his king to attack. And don't ask me why I played queen to e3. It's a mistake. Probably I had in mind moving it here to g3, or possibly after knight to c5, bishop takes, pawn takes, then moving my queen to d4. Probably part of what I was thinking was that I didn't like the idea of developing this knight to d2 and blocking my queen. Even though I think that was okay, and Stockfish thinks it's okay. Still, that was probably what I had in mind, but this was not a good move. This was not a good move. And black did play f5, and the knight did go to c5, and the bishop did take, and my pawn did take. So I'd seen all that. But then rook to e8, and now I can't very well move the queen to g3 or to d4, because then I'll be back rank mated. These pawns prevent my king from moving forward, and that's it. I get mated. So I can't move the queen. I can't move the queen forward or sideways. I have to move the queen back to defend against mate, which I did. But then black doubled up on the file. So now there's a mate threat again. And black is also attacking the c5 pawn. Great. So I stopped mate. I didn't like putting the knight there, but where else could I put it? Didn't like putting it on the edge of the board, but I couldn't do anything else. And now the rook stops the mate. The rook and the queen stop mate. But black takes the c5 pawn. And now I only have one pawn for the exchange. I'm still fighting for a draw. Well, pretty clearly this would be a nice square to put a knight on. Like so. And that's what I started doing. I started moving the knight to get there. And now Stockfish tells me that bishop to b7 was much better than bishop to d7. If you run through it on Stockfish, run through several moves, you start to see why. It's not immediately clear to me why right off the bat, but if you play it through, you find out why. You often have to do that if you're using the chess engine's analysis. You frequently have to run several moves forward. Run through several best moves to see why it chose the move it chose. Okay, so knight to d4. I'm not sure why he played rook to e7. He might have been planning to double rooks, but with the knight coming in here, the file is going to be blocked. I'm not sure why he did that. Knight in. And he goes ahead and takes that knight off the board. It's a powerful knight. Not only is it attacking the queen, it's attacking these squares. It's potentially going to go to g5 or f4. It's a nice, strong attacking knight. And black takes it off the board, not just because it's attacking the queen. That's not why he takes it off the board, but because it's constricting his game. It's cramping his game. So he takes it off the board. And I captured. So now I have this passed pawn on the 6th rank. Now, if I can keep it there, then I'll be happy because that compensates me. That will compensate me for being down the exchange. The question is, can I keep it there? That's the question. But it's a strong pawn there on the 6th rank. It's a passed pawn on the 6th rank. On the e-file, blocking his rooks. So it's a strong pawn if it can stay there, if I can keep it. Black plays a5, and now he's ready to attack the bishop and chase it away. This bishop doesn't want to move away from that pawn. I don't want to have it kicked away. And of course, if he attacks it and I move here, then he just moves to c6. And I have to come back the other way. And then this pawn won't have the bishop, won't have the bishop defending it. So I played a4. a4 now prevents him from driving the bishop away. And here, he played a move I didn't think he should have played. He played b4. I thought that rook to b8 would have been better. So, for that matter, does Stockfish. The reason I don't think this was the best move for him is that after the pawn trade, I'm going to have another passed pawn. Also, the way he did it, Stockfish says is best, taking with a queen and allowing the queen trade. I don't understand that, because if you're the one who's up material, then you're the one who probably has better attacking chances because you have more material to attack with. So he probably wants to keep his queen on the board, I should think, in order to be able to keep the game complicated and attack in whatever ways he can figure out. So I was happy to trade queens and then play a5. And he played c5. I didn't play a6 right away. I played bishop c4. Stockfish says a6 was best. But I had a reason for doing this. And I always tell my students that they should have reasons for their moves. They should have reasons. And their reasons might turn out not to be very good reasons. They might. I mean, you're still learning the game. You're not always going to pick a good reason, but you try. You do the best you can do. I've read that grandmasters say that it's better to play with a plan, even a bad plan, than with no plan at all. I'm not convinced that playing with a bad plan is a good idea, but still, you want to play with a plan. You want to have reasons for your moves. In this case, I did not want this pawn coming here. I didn't want him sacrificing that pawn and opening up this file to use with his rooks. I didn't want that happening. I wanted to keep the position as closed as I could. I'm down on exchange. I want to keep the position as closed as I can so that I limit what he can do. And when I put the bishop there, now this pawn is also a shield. If he moves the rook over here, it doesn't attack the bishop because that pawn, his own pawn, gets in the way. Sometimes you see this with kings. So sometimes you might have a black pawn here, and then a rook or a queen here doesn't attack the king because its pawn is in the way. Sometimes you see that where you put your opponent's own pawn in the way of his pieces. You let it serve as a shield. So that was part of the idea of this move too. I wanted this to be a shield for my bishop. Okay. So I had reasons for the move, and Stockfish doesn't say it was a bad move. Still a good move, but it wasn't best, apparently. So the game continued. Now, this move had nothing to do with defending the f-pawn. He wants to get his king out. That's why he played it. And now a6, and I have these two lovely passed pawns in the 6th rank, widely separated, so one rook can't handle them both with any ease at all. So now I have this bishop defending both of them. So the bishop isn't really an active bishop. It's not moving around the board doing things, controlling crucial diagonals, but it's doing a really important job. It's protecting both of those advanced passed pawns. So it's a really useful bishop, even if it isn't in the usual sense of active, a very active bishop. Up comes the king. My rook slides to the d file. When I ran this at a lesser depth, Stockfish wanted me to play rook to a5. And I preferred rook to d1 because from a5, I didn't see the rooks having a lot of activity, and I wanted the rook to be as active as possible. Also, I liked the idea of controlling the only open file on the board and preventing him from controlling it. Because again, I wanted to limit his piece activity. You know, if your own piece activity is good for you, then limiting your opponent's piece activity is also good for you. So again, I had a reason for the move. And Black's king moved up, and the rook moved to d6. So now he's not going to be able to sacrifice this rook for bishop and pawn and see if he can win that way. He's not going to be able to do that because I also have a rook defending the pawn. Okay. I was a little afraid that he'd be able to trade off one rook for bishop and pawn, and then maybe get rid of the other pawn and then win with this 2-against-1 pawn advantage. I was a little afraid of that. I didn't know how he'd do it, but I was a little afraid of that. So I was being careful here. And I was also threatening to move the rook here and win that pawn. And Black defended. And then I played b3. Again, I had a reason for that. And again, whether or not it's really such a reason that I needed to make that move or not, I don't know. Maybe a grandmaster would tell me that I didn't really need to do that. But I had a reason. And the reason was I didn't want him putting his rook on the b file, pushing this pawn. Yes, I can take it. Okay. But then bringing his rook in on this file. I didn't want him, even if I didn't take the pawn, I didn't want him to be able to come in and start attacking my bishop and make his rook active. I didn't want him to do that. I didn't want him to make the rook active. I didn't know whether he could do that or not, but I didn't want to let it happen. Now it's not going to happen. Also, of course, now the pawn defends the bishop. The bishop also defends the pawn. Good. I'm keeping everything defended. This bishop is doing yeoman's duty in defending pawns. It's not doing much else, but you know, those are important pawns to keep defending. And king back attacks my rook, so my rook slides over. And now he does get the open file, and he's threatening to come in here, which would not be checkmate because I could block with the bishop. But then where would my king go? And what would my bishop be doing? That would be bad for me. So I slide my king over to f1. So now if he gives check, my king will go to e2, and I'll be fine. Okay. And now he offers the rook trade, which puzzled me because I was pretty sure he was still playing for a win. And I thought that once he traded off a pair of rooks, he couldn't win. I was happy to trade. I thought he couldn't win this because these pawns are far separated. So although his king can stop one of them, his king can't stop both of them, which means the rook has to stay back here and keep defending. Otherwise, I'll promote to a queen. He can't stop both with just the king. Now, he can stop both with just the rook. You just got the rook sit there and walk the king down. He could do that. But I'm not going to let him do that. King up. If he tries coming up, okay, fine. I can come up here and just prevent him from coming in. Let me see. I'm not sure which move is best. I haven't thought about it for a while. So actually, I think if he comes out, then it's this square I need to keep him off of, so g3. g3 is better. It's okay if he walks in here because bishop and pawn do defend each other, so the king can't win anything. The king can't win anything over there. It's here where I have to worry a little bit. Not a lot, a little bit. I just want to be careful, that's all. But I want to get my king up to the center of the board. And now he moves his g-pawn forward. King up to e3. h6. And now f4. And he should probably play g4 here. He actually made a mistake. He moved his king over. And I'll go over this in another video, but that's actually a mistake. Because now I have a winning move, and it's this funny looking move. And if we trade pawns, the king goes in there. He has this 2-on-1, but I have the king coming in here, ready to help out the pawn. And there is the question of whether or not I'm fast enough. You know, I don't want that 2-on-1 pawn majority to end up winning for him. And I'm not sure I would have wanted to take the chance that it wasn't, that mine wasn't quick enough, that his were going to somehow beat me. But it turns out that, yes, that's a problem. And that's a problem, it turns out, because he's taken his king away from the coverage of e5. And it's okay for him if my king gets there to e5, if he can get his rook to f8. It's okay then. But it takes 2 moves to get there. And now the king, now it takes him 3 moves to get the king there and to get the rook there. That takes 3 moves. That's not fast enough. That's why it's a mistake. And I didn't realize that. I didn't see that. But it is true. No, but I was playing for a draw. I just played g3. And I was still playing for a draw. 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 But I saw that I could make another passed pawn. Yay, I can make another passed pawn. Good luck stopping me. Is the third passed pawn going to be enough to win? I didn't know. I think it actually turns out that it is. And now black should play rook to h8. But black played rook to d4, and that was actually a mistake. I didn't quite realize that I could just play e7 and win. But I played h5. And now I played e7. I did see it. And now he has to try to stop the pawn. So he checks, checks, and brings the rook over. Okay. But I'm able to play a7. And he can't walk his king over, and he can't stop both pawns. If he takes this one, I'll promote with check. If he moves his king in to stop both pawns, then I'll go there check. And after he takes, I'll take the rook. And then I'll promote. Yay, I win. Now you might think that, you know, maybe he could have moved his rook to this square instead, and then there wouldn't have been a fork along the diagonal. But in fact, that was never available. If we go back. Okay, so he moved up. I moved the pawn. He moved up, moved over. I pushed my pawn. Check. And the king prevents that move. The rook can't go there. The rook can't go there, so it wasn't available. It wasn't available. Okay. So now let me just quickly go over the game again. Just quickly. I like to play through games just quickly again at the end, if I remember to. So it was an ordinary Roy Lopez main line. And then he castled, so he's setting up the martial attack. He doesn't have to play it. And he does play the martial attack. And I didn't know what to do here. I should have played pawn takes knight. Instead, I wound up sacrificing an exchange for 2 pawns, but they're not the world's greatest pawns. And now he gets off of the diagonal because he doesn't want me to have a discovered check if he plays f5. He doesn't want the king to be there. So that would be check. Then he'd have to get out of check, and then I'd take his bishop, and I'd be attacking his queen, and he'd have to take the pawn, and then my knight could be able to rescue my knight. So he doesn't allow that. So he moves his king. Bad move. And now I can't allow mate, so I have to move my queen back to d2. And now he's threatening mate, and he's threatening the c5 pawn. I move my knight, I've stopped the mate, but he gets to take the c5 pawn. So now I only have 1 pawn in return for my sacrificed exchange. And now he can't let that knight sit there, so he takes it off the board. And I can't let him attack my bishop with that a pawn, so I push a4. And now come trades, and I know Stockfish says trading the queens off was best. I don't know why. And I block his pawn because I don't want him to sacrifice a pawn and open up the c file, get some activity for his other rook. Now I have 2 passed pawns on the 6th rank, both protected by that bishop. He's moving his king toward the center of the board. I move my rook over. I'm not going to let him play rook takes pawn and give up a rook for bishop and pawn and draw or maybe win that way. And now I'm preventing him from playing b3, whether I needed to or not. I'm still trying to prevent him from getting any activity. King over, because I have to, really. I don't want to just play a pawn forward and have an escape square. I want to be able to come this way. I certainly don't want to have to play bishop back to block his check. Certainly don't want to do that. And now he goes for the rook trade, and I say, okay. And I'm playing for a draw, and now I make a 3rd passed pawn. And now this is winning. I push e7, and there's nothing he can do. And a7 wins the game. Because if he moves his king to b7, then he falls into the fork. And I'll take his rook, and then I'll promote. I'll make a queen. Yay, I'll win. Okay. So there is one thing to notice. I want to point out that in the previous game on the theme of fighting back, the fighting back was done almost entirely dynamically. In this game, it instead consisted of building a static structure in an effort to hold a draw. The pawn on a6, the pawn on e6, the bishop on c4 defending both of them. But each game on the theme of fighting back illustrates the prescription for resisting defeat when you're in a worse position, and in fact for what you should do in any position, namely, make the most of what you have. So, try to win, but more than that, try to play well.